we're very lucky to have Romain Felli, who was here from Switzerland just a week ago. He's a senior researcher in political science at the University of Geneva, and he is currently a visiting fellow at York University. He works on environmental governance and local economy of climate change.
First of all, thank you for the Center for Social Justice for having me here. As was said, I just arrived from Switzerland, so I'm not entirely aware of the debates on climate change in Canada. So I started by doing what I normally do, reading the local newspaper. And yesterday, a newspaper called the Globe and Mail had an article about, is the tide turning in the climate wars? I don't know if you read this commentary. And frankly, I was impressed. I was impressed that you could put so much nonsense into a single comment and get away with it. So we're told there is an incredible new deal between China and the USA, that the climate will be saved and that we will all benefit from it. I'm afraid my talk today will be largely less enthusiastic about what is going on in international climate negotiations, especially from the perspective of southern countries. I will go through 3 points mainly, give you some background information on southern countries' positions in international negotiations, then discuss briefly the common but differentiated responsibility principle, which has been at the core of the Kyoto Protocol and hopefully its successor. And then in the third part discuss what we can expect from the Paris negotiations at the end of this year. So first thing, background information. I think there are 2 essential points here, and they've already been discussed, so I may not be too long on that. But we need to remember these 2 points at all time. First, if we take historical emissions of greenhouse gases emissions, industrialized countries are way more responsible for the current climate crisis than industrializing countries, than third world countries. Just to give 2 figures, if we take USA, Canada, Europe and Japan together, they emitted over 2/3 of greenhouse gases emissions since the Industrial Revolutions. It means that the vast majority of the world emitted less than 1/3 of these greenhouse gases emission. If we take only China, which is often described as the villain in this game, China has a population which is 4 times larger than the USA, but it just emitted half of the emissions of the USA over the last 50 years. And furthermore, it is highly problematic to pin emissions onto countries at the point of production. To give you one example that I know, if we take Switzerland, for instance, Switzerland has been a country which has respected all its international engagements in terms of climate, so basically it's a very clean country. But in fact, if you look deeper at what has happened, what you see is that Switzerland has respected its international engagements by 2 means. First of all, it has bought carbon emission credits from CDM mechanisms, so it means that Swiss industry has not reduced its greenhouse gases emissions, but they have mainly bought the right to have more emissions by so-called reducing emissions in third world countries. And secondly, it has delocated its heavier industry outside of the country. So if you look at the carbon content of the importations to Switzerland, they are actually much more carbon intensive than what was imported 20 years ago. So basically, it means that a country like Switzerland, if you look only at the official statistics, you see a decline in greenhouse gases emissions, if you take only the country at the point of production, but altogether, the impact of what Switzerland as a country imports is actually greater than it was 20 years ago. And this is why the fact that we allocate emissions to countries at the point of production is problematic. But anyway, let's remember that first of all, southern countries or third world countries, I will use these words indifferently, are much less responsible for greenhouse gases emissions than industrialized countries, and this includes China, India, Brazil and South Africa. But the second point, and this was very clearly explained in the case of Bangladesh, is that southern countries are more vulnerable to climate change impacts. So the likelihood that the physical manifestations of climate change so increased floodings, desertifications, a typhoon, etc., will affect disproportionately poorer countries. And here we need to be a little more precise. It is not just a question of physical geography. It's not just a question of southern countries being in more hazard-prone situations, although it might well be the case, as was explained in the case of Bangladesh. But vulnerability to climate impact is also a social process. And within a given territory, if that's what human geographers, political ecologists, and others have been looking at for the last 30 to 40 years, you'll see that populations are very differentially affected by the impacts of natural hazards along the lines of class, of gender, of age, of ethnic group, and so on and so forth. So not everybody is vulnerable to the same degree to the same impacts. In fact, impacts are just the physical manifestation of natural hazard, but then it turns into a catastrophe when it meets a social vulnerability. And this social vulnerability is a social process. It is produced by economic relations, by historical relations, by a whole history. And this is true of population, but this is true of territories too. And in fact, southern countries are more vulnerable to climate impacts because they have less means to protect themselves from these impacts and to adapt to these impacts, which will need better housing, better health systems, better transportation, better emergency responses, and so on and so forth. In fact, it is essentially because of lack of access to funding, to these kind of infrastructures, that we see more vulnerable countries having more casualties in terms of climate change and other natural catastrophes impact. There was a very important book by Robert Timmons and Bradley Parks called The Climate of Injustice, and they ran very sophisticated econometric models, so I don't understand anything about that, but basically their findings was the following. The single most important explanatory variable in terms of explaining why why countries had more casualties to climate change was whether a country had been colonized or not. It's essentially the history of imperialism and colonialism which has produced greater vulnerabilities for third world countries. And so I think we should not forget this either, these two elements. Southern countries are less responsible for creating climate change, but they are also more vulnerable to it, not just in terms of physical situation, but in terms of the history of imperialism and colonialism. And this is why I think there was a very important element contained in the early climate negotiations, the one that took place in Rio in 1992 at the Earth Summit, when the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change was negotiated. It contained the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And this principle tried to enshrine in international law what I've just quickly explained, these hugely unequal responsibilities in creating the situation and in the impacts of climate change. And the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities was translated in the Kyoto Protocol, which was negotiated a few years later, into the separation between two types of countries, the so-called Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. The Annex 1 countries were the basically richest countries in the world, the members of the OECD plus Russia, and the non-Annex 1 countries were all the other countries, so-called developing countries, which at the time included China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, amongst, of course, the poorer countries in the world. But this difference meant that only the Annex 1 countries, only the richest countries, negotiated climate emissions reductions with a binding agreement, and poorer countries were left out of these targets in order to give them more space for development. And I think we should recognize that this was a progressive principle in the Kyoto Protocol's negotiations. But at the same time, and this is exactly the same process, at the same time that we found this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, southern countries were led to accept something which is much more problematic, and which is called the principle of prior appropriation, or you might have heard it under the name of grandfathering, which is the idea that basically the emissions reductions were distributed among polluting countries or heavily industrialized countries according to their past emissions. So in fact, the more a country had emitted greenhouse gases in the past, the larger the share it received of allowances to emit in the future. That's basically the fundamental of the Kyoto Protocol. Because what happened is, of course, southern countries did not receive any commitments to, binding commitments to reduce their greenhouse gases emissions, but industrialized countries received allowances according not to their population, not to their wealth, but to their level of past emissions, which means the most polluting countries receive the most allowances, which is unfair by any count, by any standards. But even more unfair, and this was mentioned, was the fact that the country which pushed the hardest for this principle to exist in the Kyoto Protocol was the United States. And as you know, they signed the Kyoto Protocol, but they never ratified it. So they were not even part of this deal, which hugely favored the most polluting countries, essentially the United States themselves. And once they had negotiated this, they didn't even implement it. So it means that the Kyoto Protocol, which entered much later into force in 2005, and which had a first commitment period of between 2008 and 2012, and which is, until today, the only binding agreement in international law on reducing greenhouse gases emissions, covered only a very limited number of countries. And as was said, in the second commitment period, so the one from 2012 to 2020, so the current commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, major polluting countries such as Canada and Japan have pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol currently covers basically only European Union, Switzerland and Australia, and as you know, Australia is also trying to get out. So it's less than 20% of global greenhouse gases emissions today which are covered by the rules of the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol has utterly failed to deliver any actual greenhouse gases reduction on a global scale. That we know. But we should also look at the fact that international climate negotiations have failed on other counts. They have failed to produce any real advances on the other needs of southern countries, and I will mention just 3 of them. First, on the transfer of technology and capacity building to help developing countries adopt quickly the most efficient production processes. Because of the defense of intellectual property laws in industrialized countries, the best technologies cannot be transferred to the countries who actually need them most. Second, on funding for mitigation in southern countries, we've heard the dreadful examples of the CDMs and RED in Nigeria, and there have been very little funding to help southern countries actually implement greenhouse gases reductions on their own terms, not for producing carbon reductions in the north, but for adapting their economy. And the third point, in my opinion, the most important, is that funding for adaptation has yet to materialize. There is a commonly agreed figure of $100 billion per year, which is the figure that the World Bank came with in terms of what is needed in terms of adaptation for southern countries. So it's the World Bank, it's not some left-wing radical group. They say $100 billion a year is what is needed. Thus far, the most important multilateral fund existing in the world is the Green Climate Fund, and it has received pledges from industrialized countries amounting to $10 billion altogether. So not 10 billion per year, but 10 billion altogether. And the funding need is $100 billion a year. I've just looked the figure for Canada. Canada has pledged $300 million to the Green Climate Fund. So if I understood correctly, it's less than the cost overrun of the Youngest Spadina subway, as I read in the newspaper. Furthermore, most of the money for adaptation exists as loans rather than grants. It is often earmarked for specific projects and is channeled through opaque bilateral agencies, not multilateral agencies. It is often developmental aid, which is simply relabeled as adaptation or climate funding. So it's existing aid, which is, taken away from, empowerment building to climate change adaptation. So it's not additional. And fourth point, the northern countries have thus far refused to commit anything under the heading of loss and damages, which was introduced in the climate negotiations in 2012 by southern countries. Basically, the argument of southern countries was that, well, climate mitigation is not happening, we don't have funding for adaptation, there are limits anyway to adaptation, there is not just so much that we can adapt to, but if we believe the science of what is going on, even if we fund adaptation, there will be many losses and damages, which you, northern countries, have created, and therefore we seek compensation for that. And so this was officially entered into climate change negotiations in 2012, but unsurprisingly, it has led to absolutely no commitments from northern countries on this count either. So what can we expect from the Paris negotiations at the end of this year? Will there be an agreement? Yes, there will be an agreement, of course, but the question is what will be agreed? And all the signals that we have is that the successor to the Kyoto Protocol, so which will take place after 2020, will be a non-binding agreement, an agreement with voluntary commitments from countries. So each individual country says, I'm ready to reduce my greenhouse gases emissions of so many such and such %, but it is not binding, it is not an internationally agreed limit. It's a purely voluntary approach, and it's of course the approach favored by the United States and other big polluters, which actually call this a principle of naming and shaming. So basically, if a country does not respect its emission, we'll all say, boo, that's bad, you didn't do what you said you would do. But it's absolutely with no penalties attached whatsoever. Furthermore, industrialized countries, and especially the USA again, constantly insist on finding an agreement which would cover all countries. So it's first seems a progressive thing, but in fact it basically means that we need to get rid of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It says we're all in the same boat, we're all responsible now, we cannot anymore afford to take into account historical injustices, so we all need to make an effort, which is again totally unfair, and which will lead to, of course, strong opposition from third world countries. In fact, the principle was dropped from the negotiation text from Durban in 2011, and it was just reinstated a few months ago at the Lima conference in 2014, but with a very ambiguous phrasing. So here the situation is a bit uncertain. But anyway, what we can say is that the industrialized countries are preparing the ground for a failure to produce a binding agreement by blaming the intransigence of developing countries, blaming the victim basically. At the same time, the largest amongst the so-called southern countries, which are called the basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and especially China, are playing a double game. They were instrumental in the so-called Copenhagen Accord in 2009, which actually derailed the Copenhagen negotiation. And I mean, their position is a bit is a bit difficult. I can return to that in the discussion if you want. And here, just as an aside, the famous climate deal between the United States and China, which was hailed in the Global Mail yesterday, is basically an agreement to say that both countries agree that there should be no boundaries. I mean, the United States are agreeing to voluntary reductions to basically return by 2030 to the emission levels of 1990, which is what they should have done anyway if they had respected the Kyoto Protocol that they had signed. So it's not much of an advance. And China has pledged to cap its emission by 2030. So basically it says its emission will continue increasing massively for the next 15 to 20 years. And by 2030 they will have reached a peak, and from then maybe decrease. So, and furthermore, what is important is that these two countries together represent more than 45% of total greenhouse gases emissions, so they are the key players in these games. And what they say is that they can negotiate their own agreements outside of multilateral international negotiations. And their agreement is that they should not be bound by international law. So they are happy to make gestures, voluntary pledges of reduction, but not to submit to international law. So in conclusion, and I hope I'm not too pessimistic, but that's how things are. First, let's not expect a binding agreement in Paris. I don't think we can reasonably expect that, unfortunately. But at the same time, let's not fetishize international negotiations and international agreements. As was very well explained, we need to put pressure on our governments at the domestic level. And of course we need to put pressure on what is happening on the ground here. Again, I'm not entirely familiar with what is going on in Canada, but I still read the newspaper, and I think that blocking any sort of development in the tar sands is the very first climate action that anyone should be taking. But also, I'm also extremely surprised to read that the Ontario government wants to privatize the energy utilities. I think the very first step, if you want to go into a low carbon economy, is to have public control over energy production. I mean, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient, of course, and we know that publicly owned companies can be very bad environmental players, but I mean, you cannot expect a private for-profit company to move towards renewable in a time frame which is sufficient. So I think there is also here a struggle to control energy production and to make sure that energy production is redirected towards sustainable and renewable energies. And of course we must denounce and not support and attack failed solutions such as carbon markets, RED+, CDM, etc. However, and unless there is a world revolution, and I'm serious here, unless there is a world revolution, we will continue to live in a world which is structured by capitalist social relations and international agreements at the international level. And so if we want to have a way to divide global carbon budgets, so how much emissions we can keep pumping into the atmosphere so that we do not reach a dangerous threshold, and we can debate on these limits, but there must be some sort of agreements to divide this carbon budget among countries in the world. And so an international agreement is absolutely necessary, I think, in order to build progressive policies within the limits of what the planet can sustain. And finally, and I think we should not forget that, I think we should support southern countries' demands in international negotiations, not just in terms of mitigation, but in terms of their demands for technology transfer, adaptation, and loss and damages. And I think we should support funding for adaptation and loss and damages, although it sounds as a bit pessimistic, because it actually means that we know that climate change is going to happen anyway. We try to mitigate it, but it is already happening, and it's going to continue. And so there is a need of international solidarity, but we need to insist that funding for adaptation be done through public channels, that it be transparent and unconditional, with no strings attached, that it respects the sovereignty of these countries. So receiving countries should have the ability to decide what they do with this money. It should be additional funding, so not development aid repackaged as climate change, and it should be made as grants, not as loans. Well, good luck.